Are we good? Okay, so good afternoon. This talk is debugging your Metro-style apps using HTML. And for those of you who found the title as confusing as I did, we're not debugging using HTML. We are debugging Metro-style apps that are built using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I am Jeff Fisher. This is Eric Saltwell. A little bit of background on who we are. So I test the experience of Visual Studio for web developers. So I build apps like you guys build apps, and I try to make sure that we have the best experience possible for you. And I actually built the conference app that's pre-installed on all your devices, so that app that you use to find sessions and favorite them and all that sort of stuff. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Eric here works on design tools, so he's been working a lot with Expression, trying to make it a first-class experience for you, so you can design Metro-style apps using the best tools in the world.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Generous crowd. So how many here have started building apps, playing around with the tools, F5ing things? Good? Good? Okay. Anyone here actually have their app they want to build, like started, or at least they're thinking about for later? No? Okay, buy stock in those guys. And then just one other quick thing, so we can get a sense of the crowd here. How many of you here would say that you are comfortable with JavaScript? Like JavaScript is good to you?
Awesome.
Oh, nice, nice. Yeah, so you came to the right talk. For those of you who didn't raise your hand, we are going to go over the tools in a pretty high-level way still, so you'll still be able to, I think, follow along without really needing to understand a lot of the syntax that we're debugging. So no worries. Our agenda is remarkably straightforward. We're just going to do a little bit of big picture stuff about why debugging can be so hard. And then we're going to go into demos. Most of the time is going to be spent either in Visual Studio Express or in Expression Blend. And when you leave here, you will know how to use both of these tools and some of the features in them for debugging real-world problems that you'll encounter when you're building your apps. So it's going to be just kind of a small set of debugging tips that Eric and I feel will be helpful to you when you're building your own apps. And we will try to leave time for questions at the end. If we run out of time, you can just come up to the stage still, and we will be at the expo hall for a while afterwards. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Eric to talk about big picture.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. So I want to start with something. I am a web guy. I spent a good portion of my career working on tooling with JavaScript and CSS and HTML. I've spent a good portion of my career at Microsoft building authoring tools for JavaScript and CSS and HTML. And so it is with a lot of love that I say that I love this platform. I love JavaScript. I am super excited to see Microsoft making this investment in these technologies. And I also want you all to know that when I also say that debugging of JavaScript apps is not the easiest thing in the world. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the fact that it can be hard, the fact that the JavaScript and CSS gives you a ton of rope, and sometimes you can get tied up into knots, and how do you use the tools that we're shipping for Win8 in order to untie your knots and make it a little bit easier. So, to understand that, I think the first thing you have to understand is building an HTML app is not maybe like building a C++ app where it's really just one language. Building a web app and now a Metro-style modern app is really about working in two different paradigms. On the one hand, you have JavaScript, which I will refer to as an imperative language. The way to think about this is that it's like a cooking recipe, right? You give the computer a set of instructions, and it follows all of those instructions, right? Typically, imperative languages are used for building business logic. Sometimes they're used for building some UI, right? But that's the imperative languages. On the other side, you have CSS and HTML, and those are what I'll call the declarative languages. They're a little different. If you think of imperative languages as being like a recipe, a cooking recipe, with a series of instructions, the way to think of the declarative languages is like a blueprint for a house, right? Where you totally describe the structure of your user interface, right? You build up all the markup of the HTML and the CSS, and then you give it in one big chunk to the runtime, typically the browser, right? And it interprets it and it builds whatever it thinks you want it to build. And debugging in both of these types of languages is hard, but the reasons why are different. For JavaScript, it's hard because this is a language with a ton of power, which means a ton of rope, right? It's a language that is very loosely typed, which means it's hard to get feedback about, have I correctly typed a type name? Have I correctly specified a method name? Not only is it very loosely typed, but it's extraordinarily extensible. Any language where you can go in and you can monkey patch the primitives of the language, you know you're getting a ton of rope, right? And for all of these reasons, finally, it's also important to note that for these reasons, tooling is not as, say, mature as it is in for some other languages. And I'm not saying that good tooling work hasn't already gone on. There are good tools out there, but they're still developing. And I think actually Microsoft has done a ton of great work in this release. And Jeff's going to demo that for you about kind of moving forward the state of the art of debugging of JavaScript. So that's kind of why the imperative language is hard. Now let's talk about the declarative language. You know, I said imperative languages. I'm sorry, hold on, let me go the right way. I said imperative. All right. Imperative languages. Clicking. Thank you. Imperative languages, remember, think of like being a cooking recipe. It's lines of code, right? And what you do is you step through those lines of code, and every time you step through it, you can kind of see that's a little bit of state change in your app. Every line of code is a little bit of state change. And that helps you to say, well, now I can step through my code, see when the state breaks, and I have a good chance of identifying what's gone wrong in my app. That's not always true, but it often is. But if you compare that with a declarative language like CSS, you don't get that. What you do is you build a large blueprint, you build the full structure of your CSS, you hand it all into the runtime browser, and if what you get out isn't what you expected, but say something worse, you know, you don't really have a good way of knowing what's wrong in my CSS that's breaking my app. Now, there's other things that make CSS hard, and every language is hard in its own way, but this is what I want to focus on. And because of this, we're going to spend at least as much time here today talking not just about how do I use VS to debug JavaScript issues, but also how do I use Expression Blend in order to debug and visually diagnose CSS issues as well. But I think we're going to start with the JavaScript, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Eric. So first we're going to talk about debugging some JavaScript in Visual Studio. And really I want to cover 4 main things. We're going to talk about launching your app so you can debug it, breaking into script so you can see what's going on, and then 2 tools that are new to Visual Studio, which are the JavaScript console and the DOM Explorer. And these are unique to Metro-style apps that are built using JavaScript and CSS, so they have a little bit more power and flexibility than we're used to before. But they should also be very familiar to you if you've ever used the F12 tools in IE9. So if we're going to switch over to the demo machine, Eric has agreed to drive for me.
You're welcome.
So we have this app here that we're just going to start debugging. And this app is a stocks app. It's one of the samples that are available in the samples gallery you can download from dev.windows.com. And it's just a very simple app that lets you see the performance of different stocks. And we just have some sample data up here so we can show something. And this is nice because it shows you the app as it's going to be run on your client machine, right? This is what the app's going to look like in the real world. You can play with it just the same way your customers would play with it. But we're actually going to relaunch this app now in the simulator, which was covered in Kieran and Chris's talk in day 1. But if you haven't seen that before, if you wanted to queue up early to get your device, I know there's a lot of excitement there. This is basically the same thing, except now we have a separate window, which is convenient for us presenting to you because we can show the tools and the window side by side on one projector. But it's also convenient for you because you can control the resolution and the aspect ratio of this. So if you don't have a big table at home, like we do in the keynote, of all the devices in the world that support Windows 8, you can still look at how your app appears on them. So great. So now we have this app here, and because it's a debugging talk, this app is probably a little broken, right? So why don't we try to add a new stock to this app? Does it work?
I'm trying. It's not working.
OK, so good. We're in debugging talk. Stuff is broken. We have something to do. So what we would do now is the same thing that you'd always do in any language, right? We're going to set a breakpoint in our code. So we know that there is this event listener we've registered for that button, and we want to make sure that that event listener is being hit. So it's going to go ahead, set a breakpoint in there, and try the button again. And yes, OK, so we hooked up that correctly to the button. And I just want to mention now that we're in Visual Studio, right? Like, this is debugging. You have the same things you have in any language. You can step over, into, out of. You can set watches, look at locals. You have all the power that you used to, but we have it now against JavaScript and JavaScript runtime. So now, yeah, we have data types as well. So very quickly we can see that, hey, we have this equals here. We're comparing it to some string constant. The constant exists, so that's good. But if we go to the left here, we see, oh, this thing's undefined, and that's not expected. And if we look really closely, font might be a little small for some people in the back, we have location there, not location. So we've made a...
That's not how you spell that?
No.
No, all right.
See, yeah, we don't know how to spell either, so good thing we know how to debug. So now we go ahead and fix that, and now we can just relaunch our app. And like any typical debug cycle, we should be able to show it working now. So add something in there, and
something.
yes, we're being extremely literal today. So now, OK, great. So we've debugged a problem in exactly the way that you'd expect, right? But now let's see if there's another problem. Try to get rid of that something. I don't like it.
Nope.
So we had 2 buttons in our app, and neither of them work. OK. So now we could go and we could set a breakpoint. We could do the same thing we just did and try to find that bug. But maybe you suspect that this is because of some deeper error, some exception being thrown, and we're just not quite seeing it here at the user interface level. So what we're going to talk about now is at the top of each of the templates. So when you do a new project in Visual Studio, there's this line that's commented out, and I think this was really quickly shown in day 1, but it says debug.enable first chance exception true. And what this line does is it puts the runtime into a special break on error mode so that as soon as any exception is thrown, you're immediately in the debugger and you can figure out what's going on, if that failure is expected or not. And now we could just uncomment this and relaunch as we've been doing, but I want to show you another feature that we're going to talk about, which is the JavaScript console. And the JavaScript console is a live window into your running application. It prints messages about what's going on. It evaluates expressions that you give it. It can evaluate any JavaScript expression you give it, and it will evaluate it in the current context. As we see here, it also has some nice visualizers, such as for HTML elements. We have a nice DOM tree in there. It also pretty prints objects and arrays as well. And we can also now paste in immediately into global scope that directive that we just saw in the code. And so now we've just executed it. If we go back to the app, we should be able to see if deleting actually is throwing an exception.
And I'm deleting.
So now we have a little error here. We can just break into it. And we have a very simple mistake here. We just threw a string. But you could imagine that if you were dereferencing a null type in JavaScript, or if you had some deeper Windows runtime error, you would immediately now be taken to the errant code. You can get rid of it or fix it. And one other thing I want to touch on before we show you that, yes, this does indeed work now, is that this is inside of a promise. And promises were, again, kind of touched on before, but they are basically an asynchronous pattern for JavaScript code. So it's a nice way of organizing your asynchronous code without having this big triangle of callbacks back and forth. And one of the nice things it does is it coalesces the error handling for multiple asynchronous operations. But the downside of that, or sometimes the penalty for that, is you have to hook up an error handler, which you would, right? Like for a real app, if something goes wrong, you're going to display a message or tell the user, hey, I can't do what you just asked me to. But when you're first just developing your application, you just really want to know that that error occurred. You want to decide what you want to do from there. So just be aware that that behavior exists. And you can go ahead and show them, Eric, that it does work now. Be aware that it exists. And I strongly recommend that when you start a new project, just uncomment out that line. And that line will actually not have any effect on a deployed application once you ship it through the store. But you can always uncomment or recomment it back in when you're done developing. And so so we were able to delete that.
Yay.
So excellent, yay. So our little app actually works a little bit now. And one thing we may have noticed as we click on that lorem stock, it refreshes the data. And this isn't live data because lorem's not a real company, but maybe we want to hook this up to a live API. So how could we do that? Well, again, we could look through the code. But if we go back to our JavaScript console, we'll see that if we use the arrow keys, it just remembers the previous things we typed in. And we can go ahead and re-enable first chance exception handling. And now, if we go back and click on lorem, we can see that, oh, well, it wasn't able to find some resource. It wasn't able to find some API. And so why is that? Well, let's break into it. So this is some library code. I don't want you to focus too much on what's on the screen here. This is inside of the Windows library for JavaScript, which there's another talk about, which we'll reference at the end. But if we just quickly go into this options thing, we notice that there is a URL that doesn't really look like a URL, all right? It looks like more of a placeholder or to-do. So where is that coming from? Well, we could Control-Shift-F, find that token. But this is a debugging talk. So let's look at the call stack and see where we are. So OK, we're in some anonymous function closures that's inside of a library call called XHR. And what we really want to do is now just go back into our code, get stock info data. And now, if we go back, yeah, we can see that that URL is actually coming from another function that we just called. And now to go to where that is, we can just carry it into get data URL, and then either right-click, go to definition, or hit F12. And then the language service takes us immediately there, and we don't have to bother hunting through our code for that. So now if we wanted to hook up to a live API, we just do it right there. Great. So now we've talked a little bit about the JavaScript console. You've seen that, hey, it's kind of handy. For C# people, it's like the immediate window. But it actually is a little bit more powerful than that. And one of the things that I find it useful to do is to quickly try out a little piece of JavaScript code. So let's make up a small piece of JavaScript code for us to try out. Eric, in JavaScript, oh yeah, and he's also showing you there's multi-line mode, which is really great. So you don't have to cram all your code onto one line. You can actually just enter it here, and it will remember it with formatting. So Eric, I want you to write me a function that deep copies an object. Objects are by reference. I want a deep copy that's an exact clone of another object. Can you do that for me?
You want me to write it right now?
Yeah, just write it right now.
Okay.
We don't have snippets. Just write it right now.
Can you not watch the screen for a second?
Oh, yeah. OK, he's shy. He's shy, people. I'm sorry. He has some anxiety.
No problem. So I'm going in now, and I am typing this function for you. I am a blazingly fast typist. All right.
Yeah, it's like I don't even hear him typing. He's so fast.
Go ahead, dude. I got it.
Oh, you got it. Wow. You're speedy.
Thank you.
OK, so if we scroll up a little bit in this function, it looks like he just takes in an object. I notice there's some console.log statements in there. For C-sharpers, this is debug trace. Nothing special. It prints messages to the console. And OK, looks like you have a little test case at the bottom where we try to copy an object. Let's run this thing. Let's see what happens.
All right.
Oh, your speedy code didn't save you. OK, so we have a bug in this dynamic code. And now you're saying, Jeff, OK, the console's great. We tried it out. I don't want to look through all this code and try to figure it out myself, just mentally running it in my head. I have to add it to my project now. I have to add a JS file. I want to debug it using Visual Studio. That's what we're talking about, right? Well, we have one more trick up our sleeve. And that trick is the debugger statement. So if we go ahead and add this debugger keyword into our function and now run it again, we can now debug script that's dynamically being executed by the console. And what's nice about this is the same way you could debug script that you execute using eval or the function constructor, or really any place you can't set a breakpoint because it doesn't exist in your project yet. So now we can see, hey, we have this full VS tooling for debugging dynamic code as we do code in your project. And now we might notice at the very bottom of this that it looks like Eric forgot to type return clone, so we're not actually returning the object we just copied.
Oh man.
See, if you typed a little slower, man.
Thank you.
That's just what I'm saying. Gotta be careful. So now we can go ahead, return that clone object, take out our debugger statement, and then hopefully, if we run this code again, it will just work.
And
oops, it works. OK. So now we've seen that with the JavaScript console, it's really not just a quick diagnostic tool. It also can be almost a little mini IDE, and you don't really have to even redeploy your app or even restart it in order to try out a piece of code and modify your running app. So that's really cool. Another thing that we're going to touch on now is the DOM Explorer, because if you noticed in the app, if we go back to the simulator for a moment, there is another bug, because we got a lot of bugs. And one of these bugs is the My Stocks title in the top doesn't actually display properly. It gets truncated, it's pushed off to the right. We have a layout issue. And so the DOM Explorer is the place for us to go ahead and debug that layout issue. So if we go back to the tools, we can see the live DOM tree. And if we can try to snap that guy, yeah. Now as Eric mouses over each of the elements in the DOM tree, we can see visually how that UI corresponds to the tree. But,
hold on.
Oh?
I think I stopped debugging at some point. There we go. Sorry,
there we go. See, we can debug during our debugging talk, so it's all good. Now, we could drill down through the DOM, visually looking at it to find the element we want, but that's a little slow. So we're just going to do select element by click on my stocks, and then now we can try to figure out what rules are getting applied to that element. Why is it getting pushed over so far to the right? And so right away, we see all the styles being applied to that element. We see the selectors as well as the properties that they're modifying. And if we uncheck them, as Eric's showing, we can actually modify those in real time. And that applies to the whole rule. This is modifying the real rule that the engine is running. So if we spotted the difference, the mistake right here, we could either fix that right here, or we go to trace styles. We could see the same information presented as a property first, in a property first way, instead of in a selector first way. Same information, same checkboxes. Lastly, on the last tab is an attributes tab. If there was like a typo in the class, we weren't actually applying the class correctly to this element, we could change that here. We could also add an ID. And this is modifying the live DOM tree, as you could see on the left there. So we don't, even though there's this refresh DOM Explorer button, you shouldn't have to click that. We actually are showing you the live DOM, and you are modifying the DOM that's running inside your Metro style app at this time. So now, because this is really a layout issue, the quickest way to figure out what's going on is to look at the layout tab. And the layout tab shows you the whole box model of this one element. And now we can see quickly all the little margins and paddings that are being applied. And if we just see, oh, yep, there's a big left margin on this guy. And Eric's just going to use the arrow keys here to slide him over until he's happy with the look and design of it. What do we got, Eric? What do you got?
Negative 9 pixels.
Negative 9 pixels. And so now you've debugged the issue in the live DOM, and now you could go copy that and take it into your CSS and update your CSS to look correct. And there's a little bit of a better tool for this, which we're going to cover in just a little bit, called Expression Blend, which can update your CSS for you as you edit it visually. But before we do that, I just want to wrap up a little bit. So the things that we talked about, and we talked about a lot, even though we talked fairly quickly about them. First, you launch your app with debugging. We showed you the simulator. We showed you the local machine. There's also remote debugging, which we showed on day one as well, so you can debug to your device from your desktop. There's a debugger keyword, which is great for setting breakpoints when you can't set breakpoints because there's no code getter. Then there's this debug.enable first chance exception true, which if you remember nothing else from my talk, if you just woke up in the back or something, just remember this. Uncomment this in your new project. Your life will just get better. You'll save yourself stress and expletives, and just everything will get rosier. And then lastly, we talked quickly about the JavaScript console, how powerful that is for you, and then the DOM Explorer, how you can debug some layout right from inside Visual Studio. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Eric to debug some layout issues.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to switch focus a little bit, and we're going to talk really in depth about the types of errors that come up when building user interfaces using HTML and CSS, and how to debug them with Blend. And what you're going to see here is we're going to walk through a page that's got a ton of issues and look at how we go about identifying and fixing those issues. And along the way, you'll learn a bunch of stuff. You'll learn about kind of how to use Blend's CSS property pane to understand the structure of your CSS using features like our winning rule, our show set property only mode, and the CSS cascade. You'll learn about debugging device orientations like portrait and landscape and different app layouts using our platform and style panes. You'll learn about how to debug issues with the wonderful, wonderful new CSS3 grid layout using our grid adorners. How to catch really tricky issues like parser-generated elements using our DOM tree. And finally, how to do all of this to debug issues that don't show up just when the page first loads, but errors that you need to interact with the app a little in order to get to the error state. We'll show how to debug even those kinds of issues using Blend's interactive mode. All right, so let's get started. Jeff's going to switch over to the demo. And when it comes up, you're going to see Blend. And Blend is dominated by our design surface. And here's the important point I want to make about our design surface. We run your app. If you make JavaScript calls, our design surface makes JavaScript calls. If you call WinRT, our design surface calls WinRT. If you need to run in low box security mode because you need that because you're one of these new Metro-style apps, we run you in that low box security mode. We're running your app. And we do that because we need to give you a really pixel-perfect representation of your page. If your page was generated by a ton of JavaScript, we need to show you that page how it looks after running JavaScript. Now, in addition to the main artboard, there are a number of panes or panels around that, and I'm going to get to each of those in turn. But first, I'm going to take a little lap around this super, super simple app that we've built. And this is the app looking correctly without bugs, I hope. At the top left this is a little movie review app, and at the top left is the title of the movie. At the right is the percentage of people who voted that they like the movie and the percentage who voted that they hated the movie. They liked it in green and they hated it in red. In the middle, you'll see is the poster for the movie, and then at the bottom is it's a table full of showtime. So here we're showing over the months of June, July, and August what time you can see this show every day. So this is what this page looks like when everything's working. Now, let's go ahead and let's open up a version of this page that's not working so well. So there's a number of issues here. You see the percentage of people who liked it and who didn't like it. It's not in green, it's not in red. Both of those texts are in white. That's problematic. You see the poster in the middle pushed way over to the right. That's problematic. And you see that table at the bottom, right? It's grown so tall that it's actually slipped off the bottom of the page. So we're going to go in and we're going to debug each of these issues using Blend. And we're going to start with the coloring of the two percentages. Right? So Jeff's going to go in and he's going to click on the percentage of people who liked the movie, 23%, apparently not such a good movie. And I want to point out in the lower left of the screen is a panel called the Live DOM tree. This is very much like a much condensed version of the Live DOM tree that Jeff showed you in VS. Here we show you your elements. We show you elements that are in your source. We show elements that are generated by JavaScript. We show all kinds of elements. And for each one, we're showing you the ID of the element. And so you can see this element has an ID of good rating. And right below it is the element that's got an ID of bad rating. That's the percentage of people who didn't like it. And they all live inside of a div called all ratings. All right, so we got this white text that we want to be green. Let's go debug it. And in order to debug it, we're going to use the pane that's over on the right of the app, and that is the CSS properties pane. You're going to spend a lot of time in Blend inside of this pane. It and the design surface form the core of our styling and layout functionality. And if you select an element at the top of that property pane is the list of the applied rules. This is a list of every CSS rule that applies to this element in order, with the lowest priority rules at the bottom and the highest priority rules like inline at the top. Jeff's clicked the very first rule that applies to this element. It's got a star selector. That means it applies to every element on the page. And you'll notice that we actually outline every element on the page in green. This outlining is what we call our rule scope adorner, and what it does is it shows you, whenever you select a rule in Blend, this shows you all the elements that are affected by this CSS rule. This is a great feature for debugging problems where you've mistyped a selector. Being able to see what the selector really applies to is a super useful feature. But we're not going to focus on that right now. So Jeff's going to go up and he's going to look at the next rule. This targets just that 23% good rating element. He's going to go up one more, and there's a rule that targets both the good rating and the bad. Above that would be any inline properties if we have any. We don't in this case. And I'm going to save the one at the top, the one called winning. I'm going to save that for a second because it's a little special. So we've walked through the rules, and that's good and fine, but we haven't really gotten to the heart of finding what's making this white. So the reason for that is that seeing, as you can see at the bottom of the properties pane, we list all the CSS properties, ones that are set and ones that are not set. And the problem is there's about more than 200 properties, and so there's a lot of visual looking to do to see what properties are being set in a rule. Jeff is going to click on a checkbox that says View Show Set Properties Only. And when he does, we change from showing you all potential properties to only the properties that are set. So now, very quickly, I can see this star rule just zeroes out margin and padding on every element. If we go up one rule, you'll see that good rating, it actually sets font color to green, right? So that's good. We want that. Something else must be overriding it, setting it to white. Let's go up one rule, and this rule applies to the good and bad ratings. It's setting sizing, it's setting font, and there's our problem. In addition to the font, you can see it's setting the font color to white. That's problematic. This rule shouldn't be setting font color to white. And we could go in now and we could clear this value, but I want to say something. This kind of experience of looking at the cascade of CSS rules, it's at the core of most diagnostic experiences for CSS, and you do it all the time. And so we wanted a way to make it easier. And the way that we do that starts with that winning rule at the top of the applied rules list. Now, this rule doesn't exist in markup. Nobody's written a rule with a selector of winning. What this is this is a place where we go to collect all the CSS properties set on an element, and for each property, we only show the winning value. So what you can see here is you can see the zeroing out of the margin and padding. Below that, you see the sizing set to 50%. Below that, you see all the text properties, including that white color. You're going to see me come back time and time again during these diagnostics, come back to winning rule, because it tells me very quickly what does CSS think the winning value should be. Now, from here, if we were to start with winning rule, we might say, OK, we see that it's white, but who's setting it white? And in order to figure that out, Jeff's going to click on that white box next to the property for color. That's called our property marker, and it brings up our advanced menu. And at the top of the advanced menu is the CSS cascade. This is the list of rules, of all the rules that are touching the font color for this element. At the bottom, you can see is a rule that's setting all text on the body to white. Above that is the rule that sets the good rating to green. And above that is the problematic one that sets both good and bad rating to this very, very light gray. That's what that FB is, right? So from here, I can very, very quickly identify what rule is screwing me up. And I could click on that rule, which Jeff will do, and it takes me to that rule in the applied rules list, and I can just go and clear it. When I do, they turn to be the right color, and we've solved our problem.
Unless you're colorblind, then it probably looks the same. Sorry about that.
Yeah, good point. All right, so that's the first problem we've solved. And I just want to reiterate, winning rule, CSS cascade, these things are your friends for understanding your CSS. Now let's go take a look at that poster. Now, Jeff's clicked on the body of our document, and what you see very quickly here is that this document is being laid out using grid. Now, I could go on a long tirade here about how much I love the new CSS3 grid. I have been a web developer for a long time, and on a wall in my house is a special place with a pillow for where I bang my head against the wall when I used to have to build complex layouts with CSS2. And I would typically do that using something like CSS float or, God forbid, a table. And those things were just awful, awful experiences. Grid makes this layout much, much better. Now, what I think I did with this grid was to make a 3x3 grid, right? And I was just laying out contents in this 3x3 grid. And what Jeff is showing you here is that in the property that sets the number of columns for the grid, you see 3 columns. And that syntax, 1FR, 2FR, 1FR, I'm not going to go into it too much. That just means that those columns are relatively sized proportionately 1 to 2 to 1. OK, so that says 3 columns. If we zoom out, though, Blend's grid adorners is actually showing us 4 columns. OK, we looked in winning rule, and winning rule said CSS thinks that you've only specified 3 columns. But there's a 4th column here. What's creating this 4th column? Well, we also notice that this movie poster is shifted far away from where it should be. It should be in the center of the page. Let's click on the poster. Maybe that'll show us what the problem is. When we click on the poster and we look at its grid properties, I want to point out that it's got a grid column of 4 specified. Now, here's the interesting thing about grid. If you have a grid with 3 columns, and some content is specified to live in a column greater than 3, like 4, the grid, according to the spec, is supposed to create an implicit column, right? That's where it puts all this leftover stuff that's in the wrong column number. And that's what's going on here, right? We specified grid column 4, and so the grid has created an implicit column. And you could have figured that out just the way that we figured it out, right? We went in, we looked at grid columns, we clicked on the element. Blend makes this a little easier. I want you to notice that what we're showing right now are the two last grid column adorners. And I want you to notice how the first one looks a little bit more bold. It's got some white in it than the last column adorner, which is just like a faded out, ghosted out blue. Blend actually shows you the grid adorner for implicit columns faded out. And I don't know that that'll be the RTM visuals there. Don't focus on that. The point here is that we're showing you when you have implicit grid columns. Also note that we don't show the size for the implicit grid column because nobody specified a size because it was just created implicitly. And so this ability to quickly take a look and see and find implicit columns, that's a great help for helping you to debug your grid layouts. And the adorners in general are just a really great way to see how many rows and columns do I have without having to parse in my head 1FR, 35 picks, that kind of stuff. All right, so Jeff's going to go in and he's going to move that from being grid column 4 to being grid column 2. And when he does, it pops back in place. Notice how our page is starting to really take shape. Let's take a look at that table now at the bottom, and let's fix that. Now, in this case, we're going to pull up the code editor. We're going to do it by putting Blend into split view, because I really want to show you this table is super simple. This table has 2 rows. It's a table with 2 TR children, and each TR has 3 table cells. Very simple. Table, 2 rows, each has 3 children, right? One of these elements is probably maybe causing the sizing issue that we're having. So let's go ahead and select each element, and we'll use winning rule to see what sizing is being applied to this table, to see if we can find out who's being specified with a height that's screwing everything up. So Jeff's going to start by selecting one of the table cells, and when he does, in the property grid using winning rule, you can see the height is specified to 30 pixels. Well, that's not the problem. I knew ahead of time that the good version of this page is supposed to have a 30 pixel high column. But this is way bigger than 30 pixels. So that's not causing the problem. So let's click on the table row. If we click on the table row, we actually see that the table row doesn't specify any sizing at all. So it's not causing the problem. So let's click on the table. If we click on the table, we see the table is not specifying any height at all either. So our cells got the correct size of 30 pixels. Rows specifying no height, tables specifying no height. Where is this extra size coming from? I can tell you this is the type of problem that 3 years ago would have really made me pull my hair out. That doesn't happen anymore. All right, so sorry. So when I get to a situation like this, I think to myself, hey, you know what? Maybe there's some other element on my page that is causing my problem. So let's go into that live DOM tree and let's take a look, and we see the table, and the first child of the table is not a TR. The first child of the table is this T body. And notice it's got a little icon next to it, and when Jeff hovers over the icon, it says this element was automatically created. Here's what's going on. The W3C says that every table has to have a T body. And if the developer doesn't supply one, then heck, the runtime's got to make one for you. And that's what's happened here. The browser has made a T-body for you. And when we click on it, we can go to the styles pane, and Jeff can find out that some bozo, which is me in this case, has actually created a rule styling that T-body. And in winning rule mode, we can see that that height is 125 pixels, which is way too big. And if he clears the value, you see everything snap back into place. So what I just showed you here was using the live DOM tree to find not just source elements, but also parser-generated elements. You would find JavaScript-generated elements in there as well. It's a great, wonderful diagnostic tool. So now this page, for what it is, looks like what we wanted it to look like. But it's not that simple. Jeff, if you could go back to the working version of the page, I just want to talk about, as we all know, Metro-style apps aren't just about landscape. They're expected to work in a number of device orientations if you're on a slate, and they're expected to work with a number of app states like snapped and fill. And in Blend, the way you see how your app looks in those states is using the platform pane. So at the very, very top, you see this list of views, and this lets you move your app between landscape and portrait and fill and snapped. All right, that's what our app is supposed to look like in those states. But we have a bug in one of these states. So Jeff is going to go back into the broken version. He's going to show you, wow, okay, those percentage numbers are really crowded there. He's going to show you in fill, it looks actually okay. In snapped, everything looks broken, right? Those percentage numbers are not supposed to be there. They weren't in the fixed version. And notice how everything's getting smushed down. That's a problem with the page. You want to go back and just quickly take a look at the fixed version? Notice the movie poster is the first thing. In the broken one, notice that in the broken version, notice that it's those numbers. So let's investigate this. Now, the way that you would tool alternate styling for different app states and different media queries, and different orientations, is you would use a feature called media queries. This is a web standard feature that in the web you would typically use to provide different styling for like a print version of your page. And it just says under some conditions, use these CSS rules, but not under others. And Windows has enhanced those media queries to let you also say only use rules if you're in portrait or landscape or snap or fill. And that's what we've done here. So Jeff has opened up our styles pane. And this is the place where you see all the CSS rules that are in the scope of your page. And when he's opened up default.css, you can see the very top of the page are these media queries, right? And inside is a bunch of styling that's supposed to do all this hiding and moving and all of that. But clearly something's not working. Let's figure out what. So clearly we know these numbers are a problem. Let's click on those percentage numbers again. And actually I can tell you I know how I styled this was that I used the parent of the good rating and the bad rating. It's got a parent div called all ratings. And that should be hidden in portrait view. So Jeff's clicked on the element, and now in the applied rules list, we're going to look and see whether or not it's been hidden. So you can see there's a div rule that just provides some styling, that here's this all ratings rule that is sets display to none. And I want to point out, if you look at the styles pane, notice that we show you that rule in the styles pane, and it's living inside the media query. So this looks kind of like what should be happening. Everything is looking good here. What's breaking it? Well, there's a rule above this in the applied rules list that is also got just a selector of ID all ratings, and it's setting display to be box. It's using the flex box. And notice that this rule isn't inside of a media query, and it comes later than the media queries. Now, typically what you do when you're building a page like this is you start at the top of your page, you put all your base styling that applies to every situation. And then afterwards, you put some media queries with some alterations for each of the different views. And that works well because inside of the media queries, I tend to use the same selectors as I do outside of my media queries in my CSS rules. And by putting the media queries at the end of the document, they will override rules with the same selectors earlier in the document. Just being in a media query doesn't give CSS rules any extra precedence. And so the problem we have here is that by putting these media query rules at the top of the page, they're getting overridden by the non-media query versions of those rules later on in the page. So what we have to do is we have to move these media queries down to the bottom of the doc. Now, in this pre-release version of Blend, there is no way to go into the styles pane and just move these around. So Jeff's going to open up the code editor, and he's going to grab those media queries, and he's going to move them down to the bottom of the page. That looks great.
And this burned me on the conference app, actually. I had some rules that were inside of a media query, and I put them too high up, and yeah, it's like, oh no, it's not looking good. So.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people just think that because it's in a media query, it gets higher precedence when it doesn't. Okay, so he's updated this. Now we go back to the page, and we can see that the page looks exactly like we want. That's great. All right, so now we've fixed a ton of issues. We've done a ton of diagnostics. That's the last diagnostic feature I'm going to show you. But I do want to show you a feature related to diagnostics. Every problem you've seen here today is a problem that showed up when the page loaded, right? We just opened the dock and you could see that poster wasn't freaking where it was supposed to be. That's not always the case. You may remember Jeff earlier on fixed a bug in his stocks app. And in that app, he fixed a bug that let you add a new stock. And you may have remembered that up came this dialog box where you could type in the name of the stock, and it was in this off-red color, which is a problem. It's supposed to be black like the rest of the background of the app. Well, how would you in Blend get to that to fix it, right? You can't open the app bar. You can't hit the add button to add a stock. Or can you? Because we run your app. And because we run your app, we could choose to say, you know what, clicking on an element isn't a design gesture. Clicking on an element doesn't mean select it and then edit it. We could choose to say clicking meant click in your app, and typing means type in your app. And the way you say that is you use interactive mode, which is this little green button that Jeff's going to click. And now, as he clicks around, he's no longer selecting elements. He's interacting with the full app. And he can go in, and he can click the Add button, and up comes the dialog box, all ready for us to style. To style it, he's going to come out of interactive mode. And now, we're back in a world where select means select so I can edit it. Click means select so I can edit it. And he's just going to quickly change the color to black. What I want you to take away from this is this use of interactive mode gives you a way to access states of your app that require interaction to get to. And then once you get to that state, you can turn interactive mode off, and you can use all the power of Blend that I've already shown you today to diagnose, to edit, to do styling, to do layout. So that's the end of my demo, and I hope that the things that you took away, amongst other things, were use our winning rule mode in order to understand what the winning CSS property was. Use show set properties only mode to quickly see what your CSS rule looks like at a glimpse. I don't have it on the slide, but use the CSS cascade to see who's overriding who for individual properties. Use our styles pane and our platform pane to style and fix bugs in different orientations and app states. Grid adorners are great for helping you understand your grid and finding tricky issues like implicit grid columns. Our live DOM tree exposes some of the thorny things in HTML, like parser-generated elements. And finally, you can do all of that, even if you have to interact with your app in order to make the problem appear, by using Blend's interactive mode. So that was a ton, and I thank you all for your time here today. I'm going to leave it to Jeff to wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Very nice. So yeah, Blend is a great tool. When you're designing your app, you get the initial functionality working, but when you just want to sit down and make it pixel perfect, there really is no better tool for that than Blend.
Thanks, Jeff.
So wrapping up, we've shown you how to avoid building circus tents. We've shown you how to debug things that are completely broken. And we have some related sessions I just want to tell you. And now some of these have already happened, but they are available online in video form. And you can also watch them in the conference app. And the first one I want to talk about is just deep dive in expression blend. That's great overall design talk for Blend. Then, of course, there's debugging connected Windows 8 apps. So as you notice, we didn't actually talk to live web services, but you probably will. Debugging connected apps will show you how you can debug network traffic and do all that good stuff. What's new in Visual Studio 11, the extremely popular talk by Jason Zander yesterday. And then the grid layout that Eric mentioned and that we all love so much is also covered in designing metro-style apps using CSS3. We have some links that you'll be able to get at from our slides, which again should be available in the app once they're posted. And with that, I think, okay. And with that, we'd like to open it up for questions. We have a good 11 minutes here, so please approach the mics. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Anyone? Shy crowd? We'll also be available in the expo hall.
Yeah,
yes, sir.
So when you go into interactive mode,
Yeah.
How do you reset your artboard back to a fresh state? Is that with the refresh button at the
Yeah,
top as well?
they're totally. So the question was, when you're in interactive mode, how do you get back to a fresh state? So like you've been interacting and okay, now I'm done with that, let's get back. There's a reload button right next to interactive mode that refreshes you back to the page load state. We literally just reload the page. Great.
Any other questions? Oh,
Yeah, come on up to the microphone, please, for posterity's sake.
yeah, so we can, everyone
I
can
might
hear you.
have mentioned it, but what's inline versus winning?
Oh, I'm sorry. So inline is, it's a CSS concept, and really inline is just a regular, it's a CSS, it's a place to put CSS in, there's an HTML attribute you could attach to the element that's called style, and if you say style equals, and you choose to put your CSS there rather than into a rule that's got a selector attached to it, that's called inline styling, and that's what it is. So it's not a virtual rule like Blend's winning rule. It's really just showing you styling that's been attached to the element directly.
Yeah, embedded into the HTML. So
Yeah.
it's usually discouraged because it's harder to retool later, but Blend certainly supports it if you use it.
Great.
Sir?
Are any of these awesome tools and features going to be usable outside of the WinRT environment or the Windows 8?
So the question was, right, can I use any of this stuff outside of WinRT, outside of Win8 and WinRT? So I'll speak for Blend for a second, and then you can speak for VS. We are very, very laser focused on providing a world-class experience for building Win8 apps with JavaScript. And you wouldn't find things for a website, like you wouldn't find SEO optimization, you wouldn't find cross-browser compatibility tools like you find in Expression Web Super Preview. But I mean, we are an HTML and a CSS editor. We don't give you a way to edit vendor prefixes other than Microsoft, of course, because we're just focused on tooling Win8. So we are an HTML5 and CSS editor, and if you wanted to put your markup in there and use some of our tooling features like grid, you could, but where you're going to find the best experience for us is with Win8.
So for Visual Studio, thanks for the response, Eric.
Yeah.
For Visual Studio, the Express edition is, again, kind of targeted towards the Windows Developer Preview. However, you can actually attach it to IE, so any IE that's running on the system. You might have to start debugging using the F12 tools, but you can actually attach Visual Studio to it and step through all your script and debug it with all the tools that I showed you today. So that should just work. Did we answer your question, or?
I had a question. I'm a JavaScript developer, and I develop mostly using Chrome developer tools right now. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I find really useful is the computed styles pane in the Chrome developer tools that shows you, styles that may not have been explicitly set by your CSS. Does Blend have anything like that?
It is. So I am contractually obligated not to talk about features that we're not showing here, but I can tell you that that's something that we're certainly interested in.
Yeah, great feedback. Thank you.
One question about the debugger. Will I be able to use the debugger with libraries such as jQuery, for example?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, you should be able to debug any JavaScript code. We're not particular.
Anybody else? Going. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
We appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.